If you're here for the workshop, you're in the right spot. We'll be talking about transparent assessment with rubrics. If you don't know me, I'm Kelly. I teach for English for academic purposes, and now I assist with some of the CTL programming. We're gonna start with like a little baseline doodad. It might need me to open it first, but we'll give you time to scan. All right. Bring it back. If you still need it.
Automatically use rubric or just a...
Have you personally used?
Oh, like either paper or digital, right?
Yeah, any type of rubric.
Oh,
Yeah. Okay, okay.
have experience audience here.
Okay.
I like your font.
I think that was the preset, but I appreciate that you would attribute that to
Why
me.
do you use Menti and not Cole everybody? Official NYU something.
Because I like this one better. It's more user-friendly for me as a teacher to set up. It has more options for like developing quiz types where they can get correct answers and different ways to respond. And it's a little bit more customizable with the appearance. You can choose your own font and colors. Yeah.
Do you need to subscribe?
But it's not as easy to do.
Is it
Big-
free?
For 3 slides.
Yeah.
So I use my discretionary funds. Okay, so it seems like we have, this doesn't measure how confident or anything you are. Some people have used rubrics. There's one member who's being very honest about not using rubrics, and you're in the right place if that's you. The next question is, when students raise concerns about their grades, which aspects of the assessment do they typically question or disagree with? Hi, Jay. I don't know if I can pull up the QR code for Jay again. It's going to cover the question, but it's on the phone. Okay, most want a higher grade for free, not generally related to the assessment. They have other complaints: fairness, unclear expectations, how it came to assign the grade. They want a higher grade, not necessarily disagreeing with anything. Subjective. We'll say that other instructors are easier, how well they met the assessment criteria. They want their answers actually fill the recruitment requirements. Main claim, reasoning process, the use of sources. I worked hard.
What's the point justified?
Just a higher grade. Yeah. I don't think any of us are surprised by this. I think we all experience this is what naturally when we're in a grade-based system, students are concerned about their grades. They have motivations for why they need those grades. And so they are going to try. They're going to try their best to either understand or negotiate after the fact if they're unsatisfied. Okay? If you've used rubrics for assessment, what have been the main challenges you've faced in their design?
I accidentally exited out.
Here you go. Writing descriptions, fairness. Getting it to add it to the right grade, yeah, descriptions, deciding up the criteria. Descriptions, Wording of the descriptors, usability across multiple teachers, that's good to know. How to make it less time-consuming descriptions. Execution, using it. Simultaneously detailed and concise, Student performance falls between 2 bands grades, breakdown in different levels. Yeah, so we'll talk about some of this today, but some of the things about the writing of the descriptions or how long it takes you to create it. Plug for the next workshop on rubrics using AI to help you kind of write those bands will save you a lot of time. But yeah, there's still trying to figure out if it's fair, having to figure out using your rubrics getting you the grade that like intuitively you're like, this is an A, but I've made this rubric, is it reflecting what I want it to reflect and what it should assess? We're gonna talk about all that. So the goals for today is that you should be able to articulate the pros and cons of 3 rubric types, list the best practices for rubric design, summarize the steps to ensure transparent communication of learning and grading expectations, develop grading criteria based on learning outcomes and assignment prompt, and then reflect on how student motivation, autonomy, and voice play a role in transparent assessment with rubrics. So we're gonna do a lot of kind of group work and kind of working with rubrics and evaluating them today. So a lot of discussion for you guys to kind of explore your teaching. So the first activity we're gonna do, I have named same rubric 3 ways, with holistic, analytic, and single point rubrics. So at your table, you will find that at the very top, there is a stapled packet. The only thing I want you to look at right now is the stapled packet. So with your group, just the stapled packet, this one. With your group, I would like you to examine the 3 pages, which are 3 different rubrics, paying attention to the format, the similarity, and the differences, and then identify the type of rubric and start to use the giant A3 paper to help you organize your thoughts for the pros and cons, and what type of assignment might this rubric be best suited for. Okay, so you're looking and analyzing the rubrics, trying to identify, is it analytic, holistic, or single point, and then filling out the worksheet together. We're gonna go around and share just briefly. Well, first we're gonna check that everybody got the labels right. So the first page of the rubric, what type of rubric is this? The first page? Holistic. The second page? Analytic. And then the last page, I did not name these. So I heard this group discussing a concern about the naming. I did not name it. Okay, so why don't we start with this table and just see what were your overall thoughts about the rubrics and anything you noticed of note.
We have so much to talk
I
about.
know. We'll just talk about the time it takes to produce and to just produce, so everyone has something to comment on. So holistic, we found that they were easier to write, faster to assess students using this type. When it came to the analytic, it takes more time. And also takes more time to produce as well. Single point we found to be able to produce this relatively quickly. All of those ideas should already be envisioned in the creation of the assignment or the prompt itself, but it takes longer in order to use to assess.
Okay, very good. I don't disagree with that. Maybe the next table?
Are we going to talk about each one of them?
And you don't need to cover everything. I think overall impression from your discussion, anything that stood out.
Well, we were talking about like how easy they would be to use for grading or when you would use them. So the first one we were discussing would be good if you had to get like a holistic impression, like if somebody was doing a presentation or something. That the analytic one would be better for something that's like a final version, like a final essay after scaffolding or a project or something like that, because it's very detailed and very easy to get a precise grade. Whereas with the first one, the holistic one, the students might be like, well, how did you arrive at that grade? We thought that the the last one, the single point, would be very good for like a scaffolding type assignment, like giving feedback in between, but then it would be very difficult to assign like a letter or well, maybe easier for a letter, but very difficult to assign like a number, because somebody would be like, I have all these areas of success and I have these areas of improvement. How did you arrive at, 83 as your grade there? So, open to criticism would be from the students, I think, if you apply a grade there.
Same?
I'm going to talk a little bit about our discussion of we were far more confident in listing out those challenges and advantages that everyone has already discussed. We were not confident in naming which was which, mostly because I think, at least speaking for myself, I'm not familiar with any of the scholarship or even the name formative assignments, which I learned you kind of all do. But yeah, so there's, I think,
some teacher jargon, yeah.
Some teacher jargon that's actually quite useful to have a way to talk about these things. That was what I took out of this, aside from
Love that. Yeah. So I agree, right? Like some of you might be more familiar and have used these in different contexts. But I want to kind of differentiate what we see as easy for grading and what students see as easy for applying feedback. So I think the one that I was trying to highlight that it would be new for everyone, maybe except for Marcel, is the single point rubric, which is feedback focused, especially following up from the alternative assessment, lunch and learn on Wednesday, right? This is a way to do it where you still have standards, right? And your standards are clearly defined and they're still needing to achieve those standards, but it's feedback focused. So what research has found, though, is that language on analytic and holistic rubrics are actually really hard for students. So imagine, flip open to the analytic one, and imagine it's in a language that you're not as confident in. There's a lot of writing on that text. There's not a lot of white space. It's intimidating. And even though I am HSK level 5, if I get a text message on my phone in Chinese, I don't read it. I translate it because I'm like, I don't have the brain power to, like, I finished the assignment, I'm done with it in my mind, right? Like, I don't want to do the load of then interpreting what's happening. It's another task for them to do. So single point rubrics limit the amount of text that they see and highlight specifically what they should be working on. And also, you can't just give critical feedback, you need to give uplifting feedback. What did they do that met your standards? How are they achieving what you've been working on in class? I usually will use an analytic rubric for grading purposes on the back end and present the feedback rubric to the students. So I have a rationale when they come to me about their performance of where they are on the specific things, and it helps me write their feedback as well. Like, I know that on the analytic rubric, they're falling in a C in this category, and so then I can tailor my feedback for what I need to see them do, because then it does take more time for the teacher, right? I am kind of interpreting, this was a C means, I need to see you do for room for improvement. But if you achieved an A in that band, this is what I saw you do really well and I want to see more of. So I kind of use a combination and I present the single point to them if they're still working on things, right? Yeah.
Do you ever show them the...
Yes, so they do see and work with the analytic rubric in class for a way so they know how they're being assessed, but I don't give the feedback to them on that rubric because then it's too much. But they see both. Yeah. Okay.
Kelly, I
Yeah.
just wanted to give an example of
Yeah.
one of the rubrics we were working on couple of years ago. So some of the language on the original rubric, a student would have really had trouble with. So things like faux pas. And so
Yeah.
so one of the things we did was to make it more student friendly.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you are going to continue using analytic rubrics, give it a read and see if it has teacher jargon. Like, a lot of the rubrics that we design for ourselves, so I know how to parse what the different grades are, but it's written from the teacher brain, not the student brain. So even if it helps you to keep it the way you have it for distinguishment, make a same version that you then edit the language to kind of make it more targeted towards students for feedback, I would say. Because not everybody knows what we think the words mean. Okay. So here's another quote that I found that kind of stood out to me between how we're planning and teaching and then how we're using rubrics. So essentially, There are several assignments that we need to grade, and then we make a rubric for them, and we're kind of doing it in the middle of the semester, even though rubrics should be intentional and part of curriculum design. So oftentimes there's a mismatch between the rubrics and what the rubrics are assessing and what we say we're teaching and what we're assessing in our student learning outcomes, and then what we're preparing them for with our instruction. So we need to be constantly revisiting these. So well-designed rubrics should clarify the learning goals of your course. They should encourage your instruction to address those learning goals. It should communicate the expectations of how to achieve that to the students. It should provide and guide feedback for the students' progress to achieving what you're teaching them. And then finally, the last one you give them, if it's a scaffolded assignment, should give them kind of, this is where your achievement and your progress was at this moment in time based on all of these that are in alignment. So it does take a lot of practice and revision and constantly editing to make sure that we're assessing what we say we're assessing, and we're teaching what we say we're going to assess, and teaching what we say we're going to teach. So it should be part of an entire curriculum design process. And we recommend kind of backwards design, which some of you may or may not be familiar with, but essentially thinking about what is the assessment, what is the final product I'm looking for, what do students need to be able to do to achieve the creation of that product, and creating your learning outcomes from the final product backwards. How do I confirm that they're achieving, and how do I confirm that we're working towards the final project? Is it scaffolded, right? What are the steps that we're doing? And then finally, what is the instruction that leads into doing all of that? So it is a process, and I think it's, right, for a course, like if I know I want them to be developing a video game and that's what they need to be able to achieve, it's much easier to work backwards than to me say, this is what they need to do, and then get to the end and we've missed some gaps because I wasn't thinking about the end from the beginning. Okay. So I have combined all the best practices into 2 easy things to consider. Ease of use for teachers and students, and accuracy and validity of the rubric. So we're going to talk about ease of use first. A lot of you mentioned in your analysis, right, like how long does it take to create? How long does it take to actually grade? If I'm trying to debate on myself if I have to fit in an entire band for the holistic, where do they fall? Or if I'm trying to read between the descriptors and figure out where it goes on the analytic, or if I'm giving the feedback on the single point, how long am I using it? It should be easy for you to use after you've piloted it and you've kind of gotten in the habit. It should save you time once you're used to the rubric. It should not be cumbersome or unwieldy to navigate. If you notice, my analytic rubric fits on 1 page. I can see it at a glance. I'm not doing an immense amount of math because I will mess that up. There are some even more analytic rubrics that are breaking down each thing with individual points for each kind of category. Here I have like the entire, just all the band is 1 score. Up to you, there's pros and cons of doing it each way. I find having it kind of at this medium level of intensity works better for me. But some rubrics, especially for like testing services and stuff, it's 3 pages with single lines of what you're looking for, and that's not going to make your job as an instructor easier. And then this piece about the language. It should be easy for your students to read and understand and see what they need to be able to do. When we hand them the analytic rubric that we use for grading, they might say, okay, I see that you say, and I maybe don't disagree that that's what I did, but how do I go to the next one? So there should hopefully be some sort of either meeting with you or some sort of feedback that they can rely on to help them figure out what the next step is. Okay, humor break. Who's had this happen to them before? I've had this happen to me and I've had to defend my sister. I actually wrote one of my sister's professors for statistics she was losing points for things that weren't on the rubric. And I was in my master's degree at the time and wrote a kind letter. I was like, my sister is crying. I read your rubric. You said you were assessing her on this. It's not included in the prompt. It's not on the rubric. I would kindly encourage you to maybe accept her request for it, because she was also refusing office hour request to explain it to my sister. I was like, I kindly suggest you approach this before we ask to talk to the dean. So,
But see, she would claim that, oh, that thing that you lost points on is included in this descriptor, even if, but you should have figured that out.
yeah.
Have the conversation first.
What ended up happening is she did end up meeting with my sister, and she did not change her mind. And my sister wrote to the dean and eventually had her grade raised. But
There's also an additional issue of some people giving more weight
yes,
to various things through personal teaching preference.
yes.
So it's all in the rubric, but somebody's got a real thing about.
And it's not reflected in the points and the weighting and yeah. Virginia?
Yeah, I think like here one of the problems that I commonly see across different courses where project-based work or teamwork is in place is that teamwork, the quality of teamwork, which requires a lot of effort and time and skills, will affect students' grade, but then teamwork has never been assessed or even scaffolded. That's a huge issue, and actually students, now they become, you know, especially those who are seniors and have experience in such courses, they actually complain at the beginning that why this is the way you assess, you know, assignment if you require us to do so much work, but then teamwork has never been assessed and no one is held accountable. So
Yeah.
that's a very bright example of that.
So this goes into accuracy and validity.
Wait, so humor break is over now.
Yeah, now we're not funny anymore. No, this was specifically for Paul. Okay, accuracy and validity. Rubric should only assess what was actually taught in the course. So I have to go back and adjust all my rubrics because I usually do prep before the course starts. And things happen. Students needed more time on something I wasn't expecting, and I didn't get to teaching APA formatting. Yet it's on my rubric. I can't assess that. I cannot guarantee that they all went to a library workshop if it wasn't required. I can't guarantee, like I didn't do it. So I personally, and this is my feelings on it, it should be in the learning outcomes, right? And I should be teaching it.
But courses have prerequisites, and you can assume that they should have mastered
Some, yes.
skills.
So when I say, yeah, so here, learning outcomes can be pragmatic learning outcomes. Like if you know your course is building on another course, right? Especially in like maths and things like that, that would be part of your justification, right? Like I don't need to, I assume if they pass the course and pass the prereq, I assume they have this baseline of knowledge. But if I'm expecting more than what was expected at the base level and I didn't have the time to teach it, I shouldn't be assessing that part. Or at least I should be taking that into fact when I'm grading. Creating effective and fair rubrics takes practice. You're gonna have to keep working at it. It's a learning process. It depends on how you grade, what your teaching philosophy is, how that changes, what department policy mandates, all sorts of things. I recommend piloting and testing your rubrics when you're developing them. So if you have a student sample from a previous semester and you're updating your rubric, take back out that sample and test to see if your rubric is working the way you expect it to work before you present it to the students. You want to make sure, because like, yeah, every once in a while you might be, it's the thing in your mind, right? You're like, this is what this means, but then you realize it's not, or like you value that or you spend a lot of time teaching it, but when you look at the actual rubric, there's not a place for it. Like you might realize you really value having a clear and concise topic statement, but it's not reflected in the descriptors or clearly indicated the weight of that in your mind. And so basically, and double assessing. So I think we had maybe one revision in one of our rubrics maybe 2 years ago where there was two bands that were distinct, but the way the descriptors were written, they would lose points in both bands for the same mistake. So if they made that mistake, their grade would be way lower than somebody who serendipitously didn't make that mistake. So just double check your language and how you're using it isn't double punishing for some element. And then, yeah, this is back to the humor. Don't have secret criteria in your head. Don't be like my sister's statistics professor and get a letter from their older sister.
Do you all in your department use shared rubrics?
So I debated, Genya can tell you, there was another activity here in which we talked about normed rubrics versus teaching rubrics and how to modify that. If there's need and interest, we can do a more advanced workshop.
But I think in general, I think when we think about validity, it's also important not just to test it with your students, but test it the same rubric and different faculty using it, because then the results should be the same.
Yeah.
If two different instructors assign different points, that means that those descriptors
are not clear.
They are not very well, not very specific, and might be misleading. So, but that would be also a question of how the department is.
Yeah.
Right, I mean, I guess it's like, I've worked places where we did all have a shared rubric, and I've worked places where you can kind of do whatever you want. And I feel like that there's kind of pros and cons of both, so I was wondering if you did do it in your department, if you could discuss the...
Yeah, so we have a set of norming rubrics, but because all of our content is different and our teaching philosophies and what we value and focus on is slightly different, I think the weighting of the different categories is different for each of us, ultimately on our one that we present to the students, and the way we modify it to make it appropriate for student viewing is also different.
So on project one, we've got the content at the top, the content descriptor is blank.
Yeah.
And so the rest of the descriptors are common, aren't they, to all of us. But then each individual faculty member fills it in according to what the content of their course is and what the intermediate requirements of their course are.
Yeah.
That's worked pretty well.
It has, I think it's worked pretty well, and it's important, especially in a course where it's technically we're teaching all the same course in just different sections, when the students are like, well, that professor grades easier than my professor, and it's like, well, no, you don't. We have the same rubric. An A from that professor is the same as an A from me, and that our department works on that and making sure we're practicing and viewing the work the same way. What we're going to do now is evaluate a rubric using a rubric. So what I want you to do first is just look at the project description. I don't want you to look at the rubric. So what you're going to see is some learning outcomes, the teaching calendar prior to the assignment deadline, assignment instructions, and it's like a 2-page, this one. And then on the back, there's an analytic rubric for that assignment. So as a group, I just want you to read through that before I give you the rubric that you're going to use to assess the rubric. So the rubric on the back is the rubric that the imaginary teacher created for this assignment. So it's still not the one you're using. It's part of what you're going to assess. Now with your tables, you're going to take the rubric to assess rubrics and assess the rubric the teacher created. So we have a teacher, she's created her stuff about the American South. The first kind of teaching was about North Carolina specifically. There was a library workshop, and then another class that was teaching citing sources and integrating quotes into writing. And then the assessment instruction, and then the rubric. So based on this activity, what is your impression? How did the teacher do creating her rubric?
Some things I think are good.
Okay.
Okay, so I think there's a fairly clear distinction within descriptors between bands. It's not perfect, but it's fairly good. But then there are some things which are in the criteria which are not addressed on the.
Yeah, so specifically which criteria do we feel should not be in this teacher's rubric?
Use of quotes.
Reflection topic.
With feedback.
Huh?
Language and grammar.
So my answer would be you could make an argument for use of quotes, appropriate source selection, and reflection topic, depending on what happened in the library workshop.
But that would be double rubrics in a way.
Source selection is not about using the quotes.
Okay, but then
Yeah.
why use of quotes specifically? Because there's
it's-
multiple ways. Did she ask that?
It does. Yeah. So the argument I was making as I was thinking through this assignment is if I was a student and if I was a teacher, I could make an argument, and they're not perfect and the clarity of the assignment prompt needs work, but use of quotes, appropriate source selection, and reflection topic, something about, and I'm not a historian, so it was really hard for me to figure out what I needed to put in that one, but kind of, those are kind of the elements. They're mentioned in the outcomes. We can assume the library workshop talked to them about source selection, and there was a bit about integrating quotes. So those are defensible. There's nothing in the teaching about giving or using peer feedback and how to decide if we should use peer feedback, how to determine if it's good feedback, and then if I was going to include that and I did teach it, these bands would need to change, be something like students appropriately analyzed the feedback of their peers and made appropriate decisions, because I heard somebody say it over here, not all good feedback, not all peer feedback is good feedback. I had a student this week that led them completely astray in APA, and I saw it and I said, no, and he was like, don't take off points if he was right before I led him astray. And I was like, yeah, you're right, he was right. So you have to teach that. And then I would also argue, even though this is a writing assignment, this is a history course. If you're not explicitly teaching language, grammar, and accuracy, especially in a diverse context like this, it's unfairly punishing certain students. And you can argue, like, did they have a complete course of language, like whatever, as part of the core curriculum or something. But it would be better if it was specific language you had taught them to use and then could test to see if they appropriately implemented it, right? Like if it's specific cohesion phrases or things like that you've explicitly taught, then it could be under language and grammar. But if it's a holistic, is your English good, and you're not training them for that, it shouldn't be there. Yeah.
Question about, this is stat, I am a historian, did not clock, oh, this is a history course. But now that I'm looking at this, the reflection topic section, it says chooses a compelling aspect of North Carolinian Southern identity and then selects an interesting aspect. I'd be curious, I always struggle with this when I'm developing rubrics. How do we talk about those ideas? Because I wouldn't know. That to me feels very subjective.
Under,
Do they?
yes. Yeah, so I said clarity of descriptors. I didn't give this complete because what does that mean to me? What does it mean to a student? How do I get to decide if it's interesting or not? Right? Like, yeah, so it's not, yeah.
Yeah, I actually pointed out on the reflection topic that one of the challenges is that excellent and good are using understanding and engagement, and then all of a sudden it says at satisfactory it switches to depth or originality.
Yeah.
And nowhere is originality mentioned, and nor should it be.
Yeah.
Because to do original historical research doesn't take 500 words.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. So again, lots of, and again, even if we like took a rubric that we know is successful and students aren't arguing with, we could still use this rubric again to grade it, and we would find flaws.
Also with the appropriate sources, like what is wide range,
Yeah.
right?
Number of sources would be better.
So it's like many aspects in the descriptors are super vague.
Okay. That clock's not accurate. We're gonna rush a little bit. So develop rubric criteria. you are going to be provided learning outcomes. You're going to assume you're the best teacher in the world and you've taught all the things you should have taught. And you're going to try and come up with just the labels of the criteria, not the descriptors, for a 10-minute in-class presentation for these outcomes. So I've been looking around at your papers, and some use the strategy of one outcome equals one criteria, but then there's some of you that have criteria that aren't on here. So it just goes to show that depending on what we're imagining the prompt to be, is going to also, like how detailed the prompt is, how far in the semester are we, like how far did we get in achieving all of these goals, what you're grading might be different. So I just wanted like a quick shout out of your top 4 options, because some of you have more options. So let's start over here this time.
We did sort of align with the bullets. So for number 1, we just called it summary and explanation. Accuracy, that means summary skills. Number 2, organization, so clarity, concision, just the actual presentation of the info. 3, critical thinking and application. 4, appropriately credited sources, author, text.
Okay. Yours are similar?
Yeah.
Yeah. Huh? They called it application, which is what I argued for as well on Bloom's taxonomy. What did you guys, did you hear? Did you want clarification?
I was reading these and not listening.
Okay, could you repeat?
I'll say what we said. I won't make them repeat it.
Okay.
Explanation of economic principles, structure of the presentation, analysis and application of the case study, and appropriate oral citation.
Okay. Anything to add?
Time management.
Yeah. So if you,
We don't know like whether in which criteria we should place eye contact in which.
yeah, so,
Presentation style.
Yeah, I think like basically organizing presentation skills, like how well they do.
yeah, so I would say if you're going to include things like how well they give the presentation, we would need to change this verb. Because it's not saying that you're teaching them delivery techniques. So you would need to add another one, effectively give presentations with consideration to audience or something, because organize here is literally just the structure and the outline of it, not because, and especially in some fields, they just read, right?
Also, I was wondering whether we should have a space for the design of the slides.
If you didn't teach it and it wasn't taught in any other course,
That literally, I have a question because of that.
unless it's, you could put it in the prompt and it would then maybe.
Sometimes students feel like there are too many words on one slide, like they copy and paste the whole passage on one page, on one slide.
Yeah.
So isn't there an expectation, like we said before, that like let's say they get to junior year and they're still doing the same thing on this? Like I'm not going to be teaching how to do a PowerPoint slide and only have key points with the expectation that by the time they get to...
I would say in an ideal world, you would want the entire university course degree map to map that out and say in the first year, we know they're learning presentation design. It's been covered. I've only ever seen that detailed of a degree map in one department in one school I've ever worked at. It is possible. It's a lot of work. There's a lot of consulting companies that get hired to help do this. But if it's an elective that teaches it, you can't guarantee a student has ever learned that. And each discipline has different expectations of what your slides look like. So it is a discipline-specific expectation of what slides should look like. And so if you're not teaching it, you shouldn't assess it.
It seems almost like a quick fix, right? Like
It's a quick one. You do it one day, but.
like do your slides like this.
And that's why I say this verb. So if this had said effective academic presentation, then you would probably for each lesson or unit have a specific thing like visual aids, right? It would probably be covered somewhere else, and that would be feeding into the larger course outcome for a specific lesson outcome.
So this would be more of a part of instructions.
Yeah.
That have to be very specific.
In the prompts.
Because I feel like sometimes we assume that students are supposed to arrive with skills, but we don't. But I think we should also question whether or not the learning outcomes have been achieved by an instructor who took that previous course, because if we see that learning outcomes are stated, but then we assess something else, how do we
Yeah.
ensure that? So I think it's not just students' responsibility.
Yeah. And every professor has different preferences too, right? Like, yeah.
Normally for my course, the presentation, I will give them a template.
Yes.
And also in the instructions, help them like from the front to side.